I have spent 30 years in rooms where decisions are made and recorded in language so careful you could read it 6 ways and find no fingerprints on anything. I know how power talks to itself. I know the particular quality of silence in a hallway outside a closed door when the real conversation is happening inside. I know the language of delay, of studied neutrality, of the phrase that sounds like engagement but is actually a door being slowly, professionally closed in your face. I became expert at all of it. My name is Gleason Golightly. I was, for 11 months, the only black man in the cabinet of the United States of America. I say 11 months because that is how long it took. From the day the ships arrived to the day I watched everything I had built and bargained and swallowed to reach, all of it, revealed for what it had always been. 11 months is not a long time. It was the longest year of my life. This is what I remember. This is what I have to tell. The ships came in on a Tuesday morning in October, which I have always found darkly appropriate. Not a weekend, when you could be forgiven for thinking it was a dream. Not a dramatic Friday at dusk, with the sky already going red. A Tuesday, the most bureaucratic day of the week, at 6:47 in the morning Eastern Standard Time, when most of the country was still deciding whether to hit snooze a second time, and most of official Washington was somewhere between the gym and the first briefing of the day. I was in the back of a government car on the 14th Street Bridge, reviewing trade briefings I no longer remember the content of, when my driver said quietly, "Sir." Just that one word. The flatness of it, the specific, controlled flatness, made me look up before he said anything else. He pointed at the sky over the Potomac, and I saw them. They were silver and they were enormous, and they moved the way something moves when it has decided that the physics governing everything else in view are suggestions. There were 6 of them in the formation I first saw, though by evening the news was reporting hundreds anchored in geosynchronous orbit above every major city on the planet. They didn't land. They hovered at a height that made the Washington skyline look like a footnote beneath them. They made no sound that human ears could register as sound, but you felt them, a low-pressure change in the chest, the way you feel the air shift before a storm decides what it's going to do. I was in the Situation Room within 40 minutes. What I remember of that first day is primarily faces, 22 people around a table built for 20. The professional composure was holding, but only just, you could see it working hard around the edges, the muscles of experience and training doing the job they'd been hired to do. The president sat at the head of the table and said words designed to sound steady. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs said words designed to sound capable. The National Security Advisor said words designed to sound measured and thorough, and in control of a situation that no doctrine had prepared anyone in that room to be in control of. I said very little. I was listening to what nobody was saying. Contact was established at 9:18 a.m. The traders did not use radio. They did not transmit a signal into our infrastructure or broadcast on any frequency our technology could intercept. One of them simply appeared in the communications center at the Pentagon. Materialized is the only word, though the word doesn't do justice to the actual event, and began speaking to the duty officer in unaccented English. She described it to investigators afterward as hearing someone read a legal brief aloud, completely calm, no greeting, no introduction, no acknowledgement that what was happening was remarkable, just the terms, stated in order, with the precision of something that had been prepared well in advance. We called them the traders because that is, in the end, precisely what they were. They had done this before, not with us, presumably with others in other places, in arrangements that had been completed to their satisfaction and closed out of their ledgers. They did not introduce themselves with a name. They did not explain where they came from or why they had chosen this moment. They explained only what they were offering and what they wanted in exchange, and then they said, "You have 5 days." The offer was structured in tiers. The primary item was clean energy, sufficient and scalable, capable of ending fossil fuel dependency within 18 months. Not in theory, not in prototype, deliverable with the technical specifications to follow upon agreement. Second was full remediation of atmospheric degradation. They provided projections that they allowed our scientists to review, and I saw what those projections showed, and I watched the faces of the scientists looking at them, and those faces told me everything I needed to know about how real it was. Third was a solution to the federal debt, delivered in a physical medium they would specify upon agreement. Then 12 secondary items, each one of which, standing alone, would have been the greatest technological gift in recorded human history. Clean water infrastructure globally scalable, medical technology that implied a working model of cellular repair, agricultural yields at a scale that would end food scarcity. The price was this: every black citizen of the United States of America. Not killed. The traders were specific about that, and I have thought about that specificity for a long time since, turned it over in the quiet hours, examined what it meant and what it was designed to do. Not killed, relocated. To where and for what purpose they declined to specify, every time the question was asked, and I asked it 6 times in various meetings over those 5 days, in various ways with various degrees of official weight behind it. The answer was identical. That information is not part of the exchange. Agree to the terms or decline. You have 5 days. I want to be honest about what happened in that first meeting, because the truth is more useful than the version I would prefer to tell. It would be easy to say the room was immediately and unanimously horrified. That the president stood up and said absolutely not, under no circumstances, and walked out of the meeting. That the machinery of government, confronted with a proposal that amounted to the largest act of forced deportation in human history, simply refused to process it. That the moral clarity of the moment was instant and universal, and made everything that followed inevitable. That is not what happened. What happened was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. I counted them, I remember counting them, and then the chief of staff said, "We need to understand the full scope of what they're proposing before we formulate a response." And everyone in that room understood what that sentence meant. It meant, we are going to have this conversation. It meant, the door to consideration is open. It meant, someone run the numbers and we'll see where we are when we have them. The president said nothing to counter it. He moved on to the next item. I left the room twice in the 3 hours that followed. Once to use the restroom. Once because I needed 30 seconds in a corridor where nobody could see my face, and I stood in that corridor and I breathed slowly, and I looked at the painting hanging there. A landscape, oil on canvas, some pastoral American scene that I had walked past 500 times without really seeing, and I looked at it until I could put my face back together. I had given 22 years to this, to the machinery, to the access, to the slow, grinding, patient work of making myself indispensable to people who would never see me the way I saw myself, who would never see me completely, who would always see me as a kind of variable to be deployed or withheld, depending on the political calculation of the moment. I had taken positions that cost me the respect of people I respected. I had said things in public that I did not fully believe because the alternative was to be outside the room, and outside the room there was nothing you could do. I had told myself that being inside the room was what mattered, that one man in the right place, at the right moment, could bend the trajectory of things, could slow certain forces, redirect certain energies, pull certain levers that were only accessible from inside. Standing in that corridor, I understood something I had been avoiding understanding for a very long time. I had been inside a machine that had been running the same calculation for 300 years. The variables changed. The language changed. The level of official discomfort about the calculation changed. But the calculation itself, what a certain population was worth as an asset, how to account for it. Whether its value as a human community outweighed its value as a tradable commodity. That calculation had never stopped running. And now it had been asked to run itself again, openly, without euphemism, in a room full of people in good suits, and the first response of those people had been to ask for more information. I went back inside. I did what I have always done when the situation made plain that the situation was exactly what I feared it was. I worked harder. For the first 2 days, I was in back-to-back meetings. I argued. I used every tool I had accumulated over 2 decades. Relationships built on years of carefully maintained mutual interest. Favors called in. Institutional knowledge leveraged. The particular gravity that comes from being the only person in a room who can see the decision from a certain angle. I was not naive enough to appeal to conscience in those rooms. I had been in this city too long to think conscience was the operating mechanism. I appealed to practicality, to precedent, to the long view political mathematics. I laid out what it would look like in the history books. I laid out what it would do to America's standing with its allies. I laid out the legal exposure. I laid out the economic disruption. I was thorough. I was relentless. I was, I believed, persuasive. The president listened. He had the face of a man running arithmetic slowly on a very large number. He said twice that he was keeping all options on the table. I had heard that phrase used to describe many things in my career. In this context, it meant one thing only, and we both knew it. I went to Bernard Shields on the second evening. Bernard was the anchor on the network with the largest national audience. A man who had interviewed 6 presidents and who had, on at least 2 occasions I could document, shifted the center of gravity of the national conversation simply by choosing what to cover and how. He was also a black man who had been careful for 35 years. Careful in the specific and exhausting way that black men in positions of high visibility learn to be careful. And I had a great deal of respect for the weight of that carefulness, because I understood its cost. We sat across from each other in his office at the network's Washington bureau, and I did not use careful language. I told him what I am telling you, not the classified details, not then, but the shape of it, the terms, the timeline. The temperature of the room I had been sitting in for 48 hours. The silence of 4 seconds that had told me everything. He was quiet for a long moment. He had a quality of stillness when he was thinking that I had always admired, not the stillness of someone who doesn't feel things, but the stillness of someone who has learned to feel things without letting the feeling run ahead of the thought. He said, "They're going to put it to a national vote." "Yes. And you think it passes?" I didn't answer that. He understood the non-answer. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Coverage, full coverage, every angle you can find. The constitutional questions, the legal questions, the moral questions, the historical questions, the human ones. Don't let it stay abstract. Make it concrete. Make it specific. Make it about people." Bernard Shields went on air that evening, and for the next 72 hours, he was the best journalist I have ever watched do what journalism is actually for. He found constitutional scholars who explained, calmly and in plain language, why no popular referendum had the legal standing to strip citizenship from any American. That citizenship is not a collective property that can be voted away by the majority. He found historians who drew the comparisons that needed to be drawn, with specificity and accuracy and without flinching. He found economists who laid out, in terms anyone could follow, the actual human and material cost of removing that population, not as a moral argument but as a straightforward accounting of what gets lost when an entire community is erased from the national ledger. He found ordinary people. He let them talk. He let the camera sit with them. He also found a barber on the east side of the city named Piggy Wallace, who sat in his chair and said, on national television, with the kind of quiet that comes from having already decided what you think, "I've been black in America for 53 years. If they can make this deal, they would have found another way to make it eventually. At least now we know the price." That clip ran everywhere. I watched it 3 times in my office. And it wasn't enough. That is the other part of the truth that I have to tell. The coverage was real and it mattered, and it did not change the outcome. I went to the corporate meeting on the 3rd day. This was the chief of staff's design, an olive branch, or his version of one. Let Golightly make his economic case to the private sector. If the business community has concerns, that complicates the politics and gives the administration room to maneuver. That was the theory. I sat in a conference room on the 40th floor of a building whose windows gave me my own reflection back at every angle, and I laid out the numbers. The consumer purchasing data, the labor force contribution by sector, the tax base impact, the supply chain dependencies. I was thorough in the way that I had always been thorough, because thoroughness was the tool I trusted most. I believed the argument was strong enough to move something in that room, and so I made it with everything I had. The men at the table listened. They were courteous. They asked clarifying questions of the kind that indicate someone is paying attention. One of them offered me water, which I accepted. At the end of the presentation, a petroleum executive in a gray suit leaned slightly forward and said, "Mr. Secretary, with the greatest respect, and I mean that sincerely, the energy technology offer alone would make those projected losses recoverable within 4 years. The atmospheric remediation alone. The debt resolution alone. Any one of those at the scale they're describing changes the entire economic landscape." He said it the way you discuss the weather forecast. Informative, mildly apologetic about the inconvenience. The rest of the table let the silence sit for a moment and then moved on, because the silence said everything that needed saying, and there was nothing left for me to say that would change what I had just heard. I asked once more what would happen to the people once they were taken. There were 11 men in that room, and every one of them looked at the table or out the window or at the water glass in their hand. One of them, to his credit, looked at me directly. He said he didn't know. He said that the traders had not indicated any hostile intent. He said that the offer, taken on its face, was a transaction of exchange, and that in any exchange the party receiving value expected the exchanged item to remain intact. He said it the way a man says something he knows is hollow, but needs to say because the alternative is silence, and he cannot maintain silence. I thanked them for their time. I put my materials back in the portfolio. I put on my coat. I walked to the elevator and rode down 40 floors and got into the government car and looked out the window for the length of the drive back and did not say a word to my driver. And my driver, who understood, in the way good drivers understand everything, did not say a word to me. I drove back to the White House and I sat in my office for 40 minutes without picking up the phone. I looked at the things on my desk, the framed photographs, the small honors, the accumulated props of a career built on the premise that access was the same thing as power. I thought about my father. He had driven a bus on the same route for 31 years. He voted in every election he was eligible to vote in from the day he turned 21 until 2 weeks before he died at 84, in a district that had been gerrymandered into irrelevance 4 times in his lifetime. He told me when I was 12 years old that the whole point, the entire point, the only strategy that had ever actually worked was to get inside the door, and once you were inside, you held on to it. I thought about what he'd believed the door was for. I thought about the distance between what he had meant by that and what it had turned out to mean in practice, and I sat with that distance for a long time, in that quiet office with its view of the lawn, while the phones blinked and I did not answer them. On the 4th day, the vote was announced. A national referendum with a 5-day turnaround, the traders' deadline governing everything, compressing the legal and political timeline into something that resembled the legal process the way a funhouse mirror resembles a mirror. Constitutional challenges were filed within the hour, 4 of them from 4 different organizations, each with strong arguments on the merits. The courts moved faster than I had ever seen courts move, because the external deadline forced it, and every acceleration showed the seams of a process being asked to do something it wasn't built to do at that speed. By evening, a federal judge had issued a temporary injunction. By the following morning, the injunction had been appealed. By afternoon, the appellate court had sent it back to the district level, with a procedural note that amounted to kicking it down the road. Legal arguments that would ordinarily take months were being compressed into hours, and the compression was doing what compression always does. It was revealing what the structure was actually made of, under the polish. I called Gail that night. She had left Washington 3 days earlier to be with her mother, and I will not reproduce what was said in that conversation because some things belong to the two of us alone. What I will tell you is this. She said my name in a way that I had not heard her say it since the first years of our marriage, when we were still learning how to be frightened together and still honest about being frightened. And I understood, listening to her, that everything I had been in that building, the titles, the access, the careful management of perception and relationship and strategic placement, was a role I had played well and believed in sincerely and paid real costs for. But underneath the role was a man who was afraid, and his wife could hear it, and that was the most honest I had been with another human being in longer than I wanted to count. She asked me what I was going to do. I said I didn't know. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Gleason, you know." On the morning of the 5th day, 2 hours before the polls opened, I resigned. I drafted it in longhand, which I hadn't done since law school. I did not use the careful language I had spent 22 years learning to deploy. I used my own language, the language I use when I'm talking to myself, which is blunter and less constructed and considerably more honest than anything I had produced in that building in a very long time. I named what was happening. I said what I believed it was. I named who would pay the cost. I named what the cost was. I sent it to every news organization simultaneously, which is not how resignations from cabinet positions are handled, but I was no longer interested in how such things are handled. Then I got back in the car and drove to the east side of the city, to a street I hadn't been on in 3 months, to Piggy Wallace's barbershop. I had known Piggy for 15 years. He had cut my hair until the arc of my career took me to a neighborhood where a certain kind of appointment with a certain kind of barber was part of the expected presentation. And then I had gone back to his shop occasionally, when the gap between who I was supposed to be and who I actually was grew wide enough that I needed to sit in a chair and be talked to like a person rather than a position. His shop had been on that corner for 25 years, had outlasted 4 administrations, 9 corner stores, 2 recessions, and 1 attempted rezoning, and it functioned in the life of that neighborhood as something between a community center, a newsroom, and a confessional. When I walked in, still in the suit, still in the tie, Piggy looked at me from behind the chair he was working in. He had seen the resignation on his phone. I could see it in his face, not surprise, not approval exactly, but a kind of recalibration. He finished the cut he was on. Then he said, "You ready to work?" "Yes," I said. "Take the tie off," he said. "You look like you came to observe." I took the tie off. What I found in that barber shop and on those streets in the hours that followed was not what I had prepared myself for. I had prepared myself for despair, because I had spent 4 days earning the right to expect despair. What I found instead was a cold, focused, specific energy that I can only describe accurately as a community that has done this before. Not this exact thing, not ships in the sky and 5-day deadlines, but the essential shape of it. The experience of the machinery turning toward you with a particular intention. The experience of being assessed from a distance, of being assigned a value, of being handled. That experience was not new to these people. What was new was only the scale and the explicitness. The structure underneath it had been familiar for generations. There were people organizing at every level simultaneously, without anyone at the top of it directing the whole. Lawyers were in the legal challenges and had been from the first day. Community leaders were on phones. Churches had been open through the nights. A network of support and mutual aid that had been built in other times for other reasons was being repurposed with a speed and efficiency that startled me, though it should not have, because the only reason it startled me was that I had not been paying attention. This was not panic. Panic is loud and diffuse and moves in the wrong directions. What I saw was organized. People who knew what they were responsible for and were doing it. People who were frightened and doing it anyway, which is the only real kind of courage there is. The logistics of it, the communication networks, the legal coordination, the support systems for families who had nowhere else to go, had been built over years, layer by layer, for contingencies that the people building them had hoped would never materialize. I did not lead any of this. I need to be clear about that because I have seen accounts since that place me at the center of things, and those accounts are wrong in a way that matters. I joined it. I made calls that needed making. I put my name and my credential behind things that were harder to move without a cabinet secretary's credential attached. But the infrastructure already existed, and the knowledge already existed, and the refusal already existed. I was useful in the way a certain kind of tool is useful when someone already knows what they're building. I could reach things they couldn't easily reach. But no one on those streets was waiting for me to arrive and explain to them what was at stake. I remember standing outside the shop in the late afternoon of that 5th day, watching a woman I didn't know organize 6 different people into 6 different tasks with the precision and economy of a field commander, and thinking about the 22 years I had spent in buildings where that kind of organizational competence was performed for conference rooms and recorded in committee minutes and described in annual reviews. And thinking about how much of it I had seen on those streets in 6 hours, uncredentialed, uncompensated, and entirely without the approval of anyone who considered themselves to be in charge. Piggy worked 17 hours that day, cutting hair and making calls and running food out of the back room where his wife had been cooking since 5 in the morning. He had a quality I had not fully noticed in 15 years of knowing him, or had noticed and not named, a particular military calm, an ability to hold multiple simultaneous threads and distribute weight across them without losing track of any of them. You build that kind of calm by surviving things repeatedly over a long time. He had been surviving things since before I first put on a suit and told myself the room was where the power lived. The vote happened. The results came back at 8:47 p.m., 63% in favor. I was standing half a block from the shop when the announcement came through. I heard it on someone's radio, a boxy old thing a man was holding by his side, the volume low, and the words came through clearly anyway because the street had gone very quiet in the last few minutes, the way streets go quiet before certain kinds of weather. The result landed, and for a moment nothing happened. And then the sound started, quiet at first, and complicated, not quite grief and not quite anger but something that held both of them and was older than either. The sound of people receiving confirmation of something they had suspected but had held the door against. Piggy came out of the shop. He stood next to me on the sidewalk and we both listened to it for a moment. Then he said, "All right, now what?" Not a question, a directive. His voice was flat and steady and he was already thinking forward. What came next, the 3 hours between that announcement and the arrival of the military units tasked with enforcement, I will not describe in full detail for 2 reasons. First, because I was present for only part of it and I refuse to speak beyond what I can account for with my own eyes. Second, because some of what I know about what happened is still relevant to cases that are still being adjudicated, and I intend to say what I know in rooms where it can be used rather than in a recollection that can be edited. What I can tell you is that the enforcement operation encountered considerably more logistical difficulty than its planners had anticipated. The assumption, as best I can reconstruct it from what I learned later, was an essentially passive population in a state of shock, manageable by standard crowd control deployment. That assumption was wrong in ways that the planners might have anticipated if any of them had spent time in a room like Piggy's shop. The legal challenges were still in the courts and were generating injunctions that required response, creating delays. The communication networks were running parallel to official channels and were proving harder to disrupt than anticipated because they had not been built by or registered with anyone official, and the people who knew how they worked had built them specifically to be resilient. Street-level logistics that had been organized in those hours were functioning in ways that created friction at multiple points in the enforcement timeline. The people who showed up had not signed anything and had no intention of making it easy. I stood on the street and watched the ships descend to collection altitude, 200 feet above the city, close enough that the nearest one blocked out a significant portion of the visible sky to the southwest. At that range, I could see texture on the hull, something that was not quite metal, not quite anything I had a word for, the surface of it shifting subtly in a way that made your eyes want to look away. The pressure in my chest that I had felt the first morning came back, heavier now, and everyone around me felt it. I could see it in the set of their shoulders, the way they planted their feet. I looked at the people around me. Most of them were not looking at the ships. They were looking at each other, or at the street in front of them, or at whatever they needed to look at to stay in the task they were in. They were afraid. They were doing it anyway. I want to be precise about what happened and what didn't happen, because this account will be used by people who want to draw clean conclusions from it, and I am not able to offer them clean conclusions. The enforcement operation was complicated. It was delayed. It was documented, extensively documented, by Bernard Shields, who broadcast live for 9 uninterrupted hours that were seen in 47 countries, and by journalists who were present on those streets, and by lawyers who were recording every procedural violation in real time, and by ordinary people with phones who sent footage to every outlet that would receive it. All of that documentation went into the record. The enforcement operation was not stopped. I have to say that clearly because the record should be accurate. The traders got what they had negotiated for. Their ships rose with their cargo and moved to altitude and then were gone between one moment and the next, leaving a sky that looked exactly the same as it had before they arrived, which is somehow the worst detail, that the sky looks the same. I stood in the street and I watched the sky until there was nothing left to watch, and then I stood there a little longer anyway. At some point, Piggy put a hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. He was looking at the same sky I was looking at. After a while, he took his hand back and went inside. What came after is what I return to when I am trying to make sense of what the 5 days added up to. Because the transaction was completed, and the traders are gone, and the ledger they were working from says the trade closed in their favor. That is true. And it is also true that the legal challenges did not die on the night of the 5th day. They moved through the courts for 2 years, producing decisions in 3 different circuit courts, and eventually 2 Supreme Court opinions that established legal precedent on the scope of executive authority over citizenship, on the limits of popular referenda, on the constitutional constraints governing any future agreement of this kind, that are still being cited and still doing legal work. The people who filed those cases the night the ships arrived, in the 48 hours when it felt entirely futile, filed them anyway. They are still filing related cases. They have not stopped. Bernard Shields was on air for 9 hours. That broadcast was seen by people in 37 governments whose ambassadors formally raised the question, what obligations do nations have to their citizens when faced with external coercion? In international forums that had never asked that question in those terms before, that question is still being asked. It has produced agreements, nascent and incomplete and insufficient, but real, that did not exist before. The mutual aid networks that ran through those 5 days did not dissolve afterward. They expanded. They became formalized in some places and stayed informal where formalization would make them vulnerable, and they are present in more cities and more neighborhoods than they were before the ships came, and the people running them have the specific kind of knowledge that only comes from having been tested. I am not telling you this to manufacture comfort from a situation that does not honestly provide it. I am telling you because the accounting matters, and because the trader's accounting is incomplete. I thought about something Piggy said to me on the street. in the hour before midnight when the ships were still high enough to be lights, and you could, with effort, still pretend they were just lights. He had been quiet for a while. He has long stretches of quiet that are not the same as having nothing to say, and then he said, without looking up from what he was doing. They thought they knew exactly what they were buying. A pause, the sound of the city doing what cities do. They were wrong about that. I have turned that over many times since. The traders are very good at their transaction. They have done it, presumably, more times than I can conceive of. They run a clean, cold, economic logic that has, by their own accounting, always produced a satisfactory outcome. They understand assets. They understand leverage. They understand the machinery of a society in the same way that a buyer at auction understands the thing they are bidding on, what it's worth on the open market, what the current holder values it at, what the spread is. What their accounting does not accommodate is what 22 years inside the machinery also failed to fully accommodate, and what those streets taught me in 6 hours that the buildings had obscured in 2 decades. There is something that does not appear in any ledger I have ever been handed. It is not innocence, which is too soft a word. It is not resilience, which is too easy. It is something more like the accumulated specific knowledge of how to survive machinery that is designed to process you, how to document it while you're inside it, how to build in the margins of it, how to make what you build harder to see and therefore harder to reach. It is the knowledge of people who have had to hold 2 realities at once for a very long time, who have had to know how the official version reads and simultaneously how it actually functions, who have been training for the realistic version of this for generations. The traders got their cargo. They did not get what they thought they were getting. I don't know exactly what that means for whatever they are doing with what they took. I expect to spend the rest of my life not knowing that. What I know is what I saw, which was a community facing a calculation it had faced before, in different rooms and with different language but the same essential arithmetic, and refusing to be only what the calculation said it was. Building record, building network, building legal precedent, filing cases in courts that hadn't decided to be just yet and filing them anyway on the theory that courts can be moved, going on air for 9 hours, cutting hair for 17, feeding people from the back room, showing up. My father drove a bus for 31 years. He believed in the inside of the room. He gave me that belief the way you hand a child a tool you've spent your whole life sharpening, because it's the best thing you have to give. I used it for 22 years and I learned its limits, and I walked out of the room and into the street, which is where he started, and which I understand now is where the actual work has always been done, not in the rooms where the decisions are recorded, but in the space between the decisions, in the networks that exist between the official moments. In the 25-year barbershop, on the corner that outlasts administrations. He would have something to say about that. He would say it the way men of his generation say things they've known longer than you've been alive, plainly, with a dry edge, without any performance of wisdom. I think he would say, "Took you long enough, son." I think he'd be right about that. I know he would be right about that. And I think he would also say, "You're here now, so get to work."